too many product managers are building tomorrow's products with yesterday's planning methods. While your competition is reacting to trends after they've already taken hold, what if you could be the one who sees the trends coming? In this episode, we are exploring a methodology to give you that advantage, strategic foresight for product managers. This allows you to move beyond traditional road mapping to anticipate and shape the future your products will compete in. This is an evidence-based imagination approach that gives you a real competitive advantage. Our guest is Jod Kaftan, previously the head of product design and research at Oracle, and now the service design leader at Launched by NTT Data. With over 20 years of experience helping organizations from Sony, Google, Wells Fargo, and others navigate uncertain futures, Jod is known for moving teams beyond traditional three-horizon planning to apply real futuristic methodologies. He's pioneered approaches that turn evidence-based imagination into competitive advantage, and we'll hear more about that. Also, Jod is keynoting at my favorite product innovation conference, the Product Development and Management Association's Ignite Innovation Conference. It will be held September 13th to the 16th in Chicago, 2025. To find out more about that conference, go to pdmasummit.com. And if you miss this conversation, your roadmaps are going to stay trapped in this short-term thinking, while more strategic competitors position themselves for the futures they can see coming. That's a risk you can't afford, and this episode will equip you to avoid it and really take the lead. Also, if you're listening and you'd rather watch us on video, go to our YouTube channel, search for Product Mastery Now on YouTube. Let's jump in right after this.
How can you unlock your full potential as a product manager? We're sharing the product management insights you need. They are based on the 7 research-backed knowledge areas for product mastery. You'll learn to create products customers love, enhance your influence, and elevate your career. Welcome to Product Mastery Now, hosted by Dr. Chad McAllister, product management professor, practitioner, and your guide.
Jod, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, based on what I have seen when I did a little bit of research about your background and how you approach product and service innovation, you have a very human-centered approach, and you talk about incorporating business strategies and experiences into that. Can you just tell us about your perspective on how you approach innovation?
Sure. Gosh, where do I begin? Well, obviously, I'm a designer and started out practicing human-centered design on the people that would use the products that I'm designing for. But if you start to step back a bit and you realize how really exceptional products are made, you're not just designing for users. You're designing for often the frontline employees that are delivering an experience or delivering a product. It's really applying those human-centered principles and zooming out and expanding to the broader business as a whole. And how of course, I've done product design, but now doing a little indexing more in service design, and they flow into each other. It's very hard to separate, but service design is really zooming out to look at how the business itself marshals and anchors its resources around serving customers. So human-centered practices, it's really where you apply them. And another simple way to say it is, if I'm giving a one-on-one to a designer, and a lot of what we talk about in design is the power of empathy, right? So we can understand and walk a mile in our customers' feet. We need to apply that empathy to all the people we work with, right? To the intricacies that go with infrastructure and org design and org change. Those things are the hardest things to change, and we still have to be human-centered about it. So philosophically, it's really about expanding and opening the aperture to the whole business and that front stage and backstage dynamic. And when I say front stage, I mean that front stage experience, the thing we all experience when we're using a service and product, and the backstage, the things we don't see, policy, procedure, process, employees that are not visible to us, logistics, supply chain. So all those things constitute the customer experience. And so, yeah, in that regard, everything should be human-centered. And my goal, of course, would be to lead my clients as a more human-centered business, right?
Yeah, fantastic.
That's the nutshell.
Yeah, I like how you expanded that view of everyone that is involved in making the whatever it is, the value we're adding for the customer, and thinking about them. I've heard from another author the non-customer, and he uses non-customer in terms of it's obviously not the person we provided it to, but it's the all the people that kind of shape around the customer in some way, right? Like those frontline employees that might be part of the service delivery and treating them as customers too, in a sense, right?
Absolutely. And there's really strong data that supports when you invest and improve the employee experience, you inevitably improve the customer experience.
Yep.
I mean, you think about Starbucks as a model that is both a product and a service. You get the product, I suppose, is the coffee or the beans or the drink that you order. But think about all those employees that are orchestrating that experience. And if we can make their lives easier, whether it's through tools and technology and policies and procedures, those customers are walking through, it's going to be seamless, right?
Right.
So it's embracing that ambiguity and that complexity. I always tell the teams I work with, where there's ambiguity and complexity, there's opportunity.
I like it. Yep. And we get everyone on the same page about, as you said, empathy for the customer. Why are we doing this in the first place? Let's dive into your thoughts on strategic foresight. This seems to be a big part of the product design, service design work that you do. And I've heard this term used in different ways, particularly just foresight, somehow envisioning the future. I'm drawing a blank on his name, but I remember we did an interview a few years ago with the innovation director of Lowe's, the home improvement store. And
Yeah.
him sharing the story that they hired a panel of science fiction authors to paint a picture of what's the world's going to look like, what are the neighborhoods going to look like in 10 years, and he talked about that in terms of foresighting. Give us how do you think of strategic foresight? I have no idea what the context is here.
Yeah. Well, that hasn't always been a passion of mine. Growing up in the industry, it's like if you didn't read that Forrester report about what's going to happen next, you're going to be left behind.
Yep.
But when I started to study foresight, whether it was John Smart's work, I wrote a great book about it, Jane McConigal and the Institute of the Future. University of Houston has a fantastic program that I just finished, led by Andy Hines. And I really started to see that this becomes much more interesting when you get out of the prediction business. That sort of like, hey, where can we get our next stream of revenue? Where's everyone else is going, right? And of course, there's a component of that within a good futures practice. You've got to understand what's probable. But where it really gets interesting to me is when you get into what's possible and what's preferable, right? And the possible is the exciting part because what often gets lost in trying to anticipate the future is personal agency. And so, philosophically, a foresight practitioner, or even just someone who builds themselves as a futures thinker, would say that personal agency is a big driver of it. In other words, is this a future that I want to live in? And so, if I could draw a triangle for you, right, at one end you start with the probable, you go to what's possible, what could be a possible future, and then when you get to the top of the pyramid, you're looking at preferred futures, where you are really trying to curate between both the probable and possible futures to say this is the one we want. And the one we want isn't just, it's not like you're writing a PRD, you know? It is anchored in the values that you want to prevail. So it's ultimately human, and that's what as someone who loves technology, but also loves human components and principles, it is about what values should prevail. Now, values is an interesting thing because those can also change. A good foresight project will essentially expose us to questions that we haven't even considered asking. So, in that regard, it's really about using the future as a kind of limitless canvas to point back. And often what we create in that limitless canvas is what we call guiding images. That could be through scenario planning. These are sort of extrapolations and stories that, based on the evidence we've collected, could be a probable or possible future. And then we use that, we bring that information and say, well, what questions does that bring up for us? What actions could we or should we be taking today that could lead to that? So in that regard, it's a slight shift from just getting out of the prediction business and into the how can we be a more agile, adaptive organization. Or even some people are even practicing personal foresight, right? You can do it with your own life. But it's something I've actually been thinking about because there's another great body of work by this guy named Otto Scharmer who talks a lot about how organizational progress is linked to individual evolution. And there's a great quote by this guy, Peter Singe. I might be mispronouncing his last name. But he says that the success of any intervention depends upon the interior condition of the intervener, right? So we can't bring through seismic change. We can't bring through transformations that actually benefit a broad pool of stakeholders when we, as the change maker, are filled with bias and have tons of blind spots, right? So the futurist really has to take care of their own internal house in order to truly be effective. So anyway, it's a fascinating field. I'm still learning myself, and I enjoy bringing these principles into traditional product development.
Excellent. I do like frameworks and tools to help us think about how we can apply things. And there were some good ones that went by in what you were talking about, just the triangle framework of what's the probable, possible, and then what's preferred, and thinking about how can we work towards that preferred state, what are the values involved. You mentioned scenario planning along the way. Take us a little bit deeper into how you might help our audience, product managers, product leaders, what kinds of tools or frameworks to help them think about applying the strategic foresight to improve their product road mapping, to improve where they're headed on their product designs. Where might we start with that?
Yeah, so like with any, even in design thinking or service design, we always try to define the current state, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because systems are so, what is it? Donella Meadows says the only way to really define the system is by the boundaries in which you draw it, because systems are so overlapping all the time. And so often people get off on the wrong foot by not chiseling and framing their problem statement. What questions do you want to address? What known questions? Ironically, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. You might, at the end of your outcome, have all the unknown questions that are the fruits of the labor, right? That you're going to bring back, and that happens after a foresight. But yeah, I would start with kind of assessing the current state. Where are the gaps? Where are the big unknowns? Right? Where are the things that, if you don't have a point of view on them, that could be a potentially high impact? It might even, and what I didn't mention in the pyramid, and now there's a modern version of it called the 4P pyramid, is right next to preferred is preventable. And so there's a whole, I forget the author's name, but there's a subset of futures practice called threat casting, where you are intentionally trying to kind of use shadow imagination to assess where those big threats could come from. One quick little side story, and I'll go back to your original question. The Institute of the Future ran a massive online game, I think around the late aughts, where it was like a role-playing game. And the two realities in the game were that there was a massive pandemic, and the information about the pandemic was very unreliable. So, of course, 2020 happens, and they surveyed the original participants in that game. And they found, I think, and this might not be exact, but roughly that like 50% of those participants felt much less anxiety than everyone else was feeling at the time. And they also felt roughly about the same percentage in terms of how prepared they felt to respond to that threat, which is a big part of foresight practice, where thinking about preventable futures allows your brain, your prefrontal cortex, to actually pre-process it. And not just your prefrontal cortex, your amygdala, all the components of your brain, to pre-process it. And then should something happen, you have that sense of prowess and agency to respond to it. So that's pretty cool, because that is, when someone asks me why practice this stuff, Well, it really is about creating a future self of you or your organization
Mhm.
that is highly adaptive and agile, which is of course connected to evolutionary best practices. I mean, that's how our species has survived. The parts of our brains that are always anticipating the future. So, anyhow, that's an important principle, but start with that current state and then really start to look at signals. So, some might
Mm.
call them weak signals. Institute of the Future would call a signal evidence of the future in the present. So these are things that when you read a news story, like I read one the other day that said China had invented a laser that could power a drone in the air indefinitely by shooting a laser at it. So it would never run out of battery. Well, okay, it's an interesting invention, but what would happen if that scaled broadly and we were living with products that never ran out of battery? What would be the environmental implications? What would be the modern benefits of it from going to your job and living at home every day? So there are little provocations to be introspective and reflective on. And so you collect these signals, and often you collect them through what we call a steep analysis or steep lenses. So social, technological,
Mm.
environmental, economic, and political. And you're trying to get as well-rounded, or another way would be holistic, right? These forces of change expressed through signals. And when you get those signals, you can start to, just like a design thinker would or a design researcher would do with ethnographic research, they would start to see themes, right? And then you get those themes. Now, there are slightly different methodologies, like the Institute of the Future and the University of Houston approach it a little different. But ultimately, you're getting these signals and or drivers, these themes, and then from there, and I'm short circuiting a few steps, but you would start to write these scenarios, and then from the scenarios, right, you react to them, and you say, well, what would need to be true for that scenario to come to life? And you get into more action planning and things of that nature, and you assess the implications of your various scenarios. But your scenarios can be expressed in a lot of ways. Typically, because it came from the strategy practice, a scenario was like a written story or a written paragraph. But I'm seeing people get really creative with them. You could make a video, you could make a future state prototype as an artifact of that future scenario, right? And we all know that, and this goes all the way back to constructivist philosophy. When you make something, you activate so much more of your brain, and it becomes, you're essentially creating meaning through making something. It moves from the abstract to the concrete or the
Mhm.
intangible to the tangible. So you could make a future state prototype, and as long as you qualify it with the evidence that informed it, you can get some really interesting pathways that come out of that.
Yeah, and passing this notion of prototypes themselves being so valuable, as you said, to activate other parts of our brain, and it gives us more dimensions to communicate and to ponder as well. And we see that as a key capability that came about through design thinking. That prototypes help us get things out of our brain into a physical form, and doing this as a
Absolutely.
future state of what we've been learning. That makes good sense. I like the video suggestion too. I've paid attention recently to the changes that Google's made with Flow, and it seems like there's so many of these AI frameworks now for making videos for you from some simple prompting, and like this is going to open up that as well. I think an example would help us think through this some. I'm curious, like the team you put together to engage in the foresighting activities, to think through the problem statement, the questions that we should be asking, look at some of these signals. Do you have an example of maybe how a product direction changed or was impacted by this sort of work and what that work looked like?
Yeah, I've certainly experimented with it in my practice at Oracle, and will certainly use it more now that I'm at NTT Data. But one classic case study is Shell Oil in the 1970s, spurned by what they saw was going to be a crisis, an oil crisis. Quickly went through some scenario planning and really invested a lot in this to understand how they need to adapt, right, to this new reality. And I don't remember the total historical context of it. I think the price of oil shot up, and I do vaguely remember there being gas lines at that time. But yeah, this is a published study. I think you can probably get it on the web, and it's an old school kind of like case study that almost everyone refers to when they're getting into it. I personally have done it with a bunch of energy executives, global energy executives. I had them think in 10-year horizons. So I said, and there's a whole rationale for why 10 years or even longer. And here are some things that I like about that. One is there are no facts in the future. 10 years is just beyond the realm of things that we can responsibly predict in most cases. There's a lot that can happen in 10 years. The iPhone came out, around 2007. 10 years later, it went from maybe a million to a billion, and everyone had one in their pocket. Facebook, same-sex law. I mean, these 10-year trajectories are transformative. So in that regard, that's the minimum viable future for a lot of paradigm shifts. But we did that, and I was a little nervous, frankly, because they're energy executives, and if you've been around utilities culture, it can be pretty dry at times, a little techy.
Things don't change quickly.
But they had so much fun. They were totally engaged, and they came up with some really interesting concepts. One that stuck with me was kind of creating a utility in the metaverse and how they could increase their revenue that way, and how they could be using sort of digital twins in this metaverse in order to be better at forecasts and prevent outages. So it gave them this, I guess, creative permission space
Right.
to be daring and to be bold when these are guys that spend all day looking at spreadsheets and you hear about today's problems. They don't often give themselves the opportunity to think about, okay, what future do we want? What would be an interesting one? And so it does give people that permission space to use their imagination. One quick thing on imagination. So Jane McConnell has this whole great book called Imaginable, and she talks a lot about what's called evidence-based imagination, and this is using your imagination in a very deliberate and detailed way. And there's this sci-fi writer who does this all the time. Her name's Octavia Butler, and she will, before she writes anything, she sits down and she imagines every painstaking detail in the environment. So what are the settings? And then in the settings, she kind of opportunity detection happens. There's like, okay, what are the things that are really different in this future? And she imagines it all in her head. And then when she sits down to write, she writes, right? But she's writing from that very, very detailed memory, ironically. So when she was interviewed once, they said, how would you describe your writing? She's like, I remember the future. Because she's imagining it with such detail. So that is the way to do it. It's not just daydreaming. You're using like 11 regions of your brain versus like 7 with regular daydreaming. So the more detail you can get, the better.
And paint the picture vividly in your mind to help you
Exactly.
think about things being different. Okay, what's a practical step that product managers could take to using strategic foresighting? We've got into some things that sound very interesting, but we need to land on something that we can put into action here.
Yeah, well, first I would start to develop the muscle memory around collecting good signals. We all read the news, and a lot of it can come from the news. Sometimes they come from new policy or academia. But even in just the news feed that you might be doom scrolling through, there are going to be some really interesting stories out there. And if you one way you could organize your signals is by industry. So like the future of utilities or the future of healthcare. That could be one way to do it. It could be through steep factors. It could be social, economic, political, etc. It could be, you could organize your signal collection by any framework that makes sense for you. But I would start to get in the business of collecting signals and then give yourself a little moment to reflect on that. Like, what would happen if this became the new normal, right? This is a little invention right now, but what if everyone's using it in 5 years? What other things would it be a threat to that it could disrupt, right? There's all sorts of questions you could ask. But usually the hard part is just training your brain to orient itself to scanning, constantly
Hmm.
scanning, and not just scanning within your little industry bubble, which can have a big echo chamber in it. Go beyond it. That's where the interesting ideas are. Systems are changed from within. I'm sorry, from outside of it, rather. There's a lot of things that COVID changed that no one would, a product manager working on a healthcare product probably didn't even anticipate. So looking outside the context in which you live and function is where the most agility is going to come from.
Okay, so we have to make ourselves a little more disciplined to be thinking in this manner in the first place, right? Train our brains, be looking for those signals, start organizing them. I would imagine, just like innovation is a team sport, it benefits greatly from working with others. That interacting with others on these topics is very helpful as well, because they're probably picking up on signals that you can relate to but haven't incorporated yet, and it just amplifies what we're doing to detect what might be happening.
Yeah, it's critical. I mean, it would be great to collaborate with other product managers. I mean, more important thing, certainly discipline is having a multidisciplinary or cross-functional collaboration in any foresight activity is I fully support that and recommend it. But more importantly, bring people into it that have an open mind, that have the same kind of ambition and intent, right? Because if you bring someone that's kind of resisting or cynical, they can be helpful too, actually. Like you want the cynic in the room sometimes because they can challenge you in good ways. But for the most part, it's asking people to think differently and to use their imagination, which most modern technical organizations are not doing. So you're going to need to find your like-minded individuals is a place to start, regardless of what their discipline is.
Yep. Okay, good. So, as we're thinking about trying to, what are the signals we're seeing today that will impact the future? Let's apply that to product managers. And what do you think? And I don't know if you want to go out 10 years or not, but what do you think is in the path that might be shifting or transforming how just product managers are product managers? Is this a discipline that's going to change in some way over the next few years?
I think it very much will. I can, as a designer, I can see to how it might change for design. And I think very similar, since product management and UX and is so tied at the hip, I feel like we're a two-headed monster together. The main thing is with UX, you get people that are obsessed with the customer experience, with customer needs. They're sort of like a dedicated lens, whereas the product manager cares equally, I think, about that, but has to care about and be accountable for other things too, like profitability and integration and technology strategy, and they're really an integrator. And at a subset level, I think even design today, you're you're looking at. Well, I spoke with someone who works. I'll say they work at Google, and they were walking me through their whole design flow, and it was fascinating because they're basically a team of one, and they're doing everything, literally going through
Hmm.
the business discovery, the product discovery, even the collaboration process, usability testing, MVP planning. The only thing they're not doing with AI agents is basically ethnography, which it's just not there for that, and nor arguably should it be. Although you can certainly use AI as a kind of support lever for doing ethnography. But he will even create custom GPTs of collaborator types so that
Hmm.
when he's working on a concept, he's like, oh, I'm going to create a custom GPT profile of this person I know. It could be even a public figure that has a known bias against these types of products. I want to see what they would say, right? So I think that's a vision of the future where whether it's a product manager or a senior designer, people are going to have to be more on the senior side and they're going to be more orchestrators of the product development cycle. I hope that human to human collaboration will still happen, certainly for highly ambitious, highly complex, and highly ambiguous opportunities. But I think the nuts and bolts and meat and potatoes could be teams of one working with their own tools to put products in market. It's an interesting future. I don't know it's the right future, but I think that's something that I'm seeing emerge.
Yeah, definitely the impact of AI in work kind of across the board these days, right? But I know my own patterns. I find myself using it as a collaboration tool many times. An interesting example from the person doing the entire life cycle strategy work and uncovering unmet needs and with AI tools as an individual. Hopefully, we'll have the human, like you said, interaction as well in the next 10 years. And we're still collaborating as people. And AI will probably continue on this path of being very good at pattern recognition, but I think it will still take us, perhaps because of our collaboration with humans, that can do the new thing.
Absolutely. And I think that the risk in some of that, of course, is all the models are trained on existing data, right? And so when it comes to novelty and innovation and disruption, it can be a cycle of commoditization of those things because the data is coming from the past, right? So how do you truly be novel? I think that'll still be a principle and a good challenge. That one of the things we'd say in Foresight is one great way to, other than just collecting signals, would be start taking these micro actions, start doing things a little different. And it actually impacts how your brain would use its imagination in the future. Because if you start to change your behaviors, right, your hippocampus in your brain has new data to draw on to imaginate from. And so those new behaviors can be in how we collaborate. So we have to change still and experiment so that the models can take in new data and be better AI collaborators to it. But we're still in the lead. Otherwise, it's just going to be data that's going to be feeding itself and it's going to start to, right, everything looks the same.
Yeah.
So that's one way we combat it.
We need to be collaborating with each other, even as we're using the AI tools for sure. I've enjoyed our discussion. We're going to have the chance to continue this, and anyone that's coming to the conference will hear more from you during your keynote. And that's the conference that PDMA does, the Product Development and Management Association Conference. It's taking place in Chicago this year, 2025, from September 13th to 16th. And do you know what you're going to be addressing yet at this keynote?
Well, I might add some new stuff to it, but it's probably more of an introduction to the Foresight toolkit. But I'm thinking now of ways of bringing in more of a product management perspective to it. So it's a work in progress, but ultimately it's a sort of an exposure to an introduction to foresight and design.
Fantastic. Yeah. And a good
Yeah.
opportunity for anyone at the conference to interact with you and learn more about this as well. For people that want to check into that conference, it is my favorite conference each year on the topic of product innovation. Great group of people that show up, and we get to go deep into some topics and learn from each other. Conference information is at the website pdmasummit.com, and you can register there, find out more about it as well. We do like innovation quotes. You already shared a few good ones in passing. Do you have another innovation quote you want to share with us as well?
Well, I don't know if I would call this an innovation quote, and this might be more paraphrasing than literal, but Alvin Toffler wrote the book Future Shock. He's kind of one of the, the original luminaries of foresight. And he said the skill of the 21st century will be unlearning and learning. And I love that because innovation, if you think about it, and this never gets talked about, begins with unlearning, right? I think if you talk to executives 20 years ago, they would have told you you're crazy that there's going to be self-driving cars. No one will ever give that up. And in fact, there's some documentation that supports that. But they had to unlearn that in order to really be able to make space in their brain to create a new reality. So if you don't unlearn, you can't learn.
Yeah, that's really good. And an interesting signal popped in my brain as you were sharing that too, that when my kids were at that age where I was so eager to get that learner's permit and start driving, not so much. And none of their friends either. Everyone's like, I don't know if I really need to learn how to drive. Like, what are you talking
Yeah,
about?
I know my son's the same way. I'm like, tell you, what's wrong with you guys? Yeah, no
So,
desire.
yeah, definitely a signal. We better have self-driving cars here sooner than later. Excellent discussion. How can people find out about the work you're doing? Anything you want to share with us?
Sure, I have a little website that I keep up. I'm also an executive coach. I don't have much time to do that, but I enjoy it. And I have a little site called Design Led Futures. I think it's design-led-futures.com. So if you want to learn more about me on there, or there's probably plenty of information on my LinkedIn page as well.
Okay. We will put both links in the show notes for this episode, your LinkedIn profile, as well as the link to your website design, we think, design-ledfutures.com. The links that work will be in the show notes. Jod, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for discussing foresighting with us and helping us to think about exercising and developing this muscle.
You got it. Thanks for having me, Chad. We got it done.
I'm glad we got it done. And listeners, if you want to find the written version of anything we talked about today, simply go to productmasterynow.com/546. As always, keep innovating.
Thank you for listening to Product Mastery Now, where product leaders and managers gain product mastery through practical knowledge, influence, and confidence. By listening, you are becoming a product master, creating products customers love. Find additional resources at productmasterynow.com. Keep innovating.